Gavin Calloway scanned the glossy, gold-edged envelope that had arrived on his doorstep at sunrise, the wax seal unbroken and marked with a symbol he did not recognize. It was a compass set against a black background with one word stamped across it in delicate gold script, Eldoria. He slid it open, extracting a single sheet of ivory paper that felt thick and cold to the touch, unlike any invitation he'd received before. To Mr. Gavin Calloway, it began, written in elegant calligraphy. You are invited to a gathering of unique minds and remarkable individuals. Your presence is requested at a private auction, where only the rarest treasures will be unveiled, items known to shape the lives of those who possess them. This gathering is designed for the world's elite, a carefully chosen group with extraordinary histories. This auction may answer questions you've held in silence, illuminate memories lost in darkness, and fulfill desires you thought were unattainable. However, entry will come at a price. If you accept, your private plane will depart Friday at midnight. Your destination is the island of Eldoria. There was no signature, no number to contact, only a set of coordinates printed below the text. Gavin's curiosity flared. He could feel the undercurrent of something strange, something that held more allure and risk than he'd encountered in years. But despite its enticing promise, the invitation raised a deep unease. What could this island auction offer him? Wealth had been his constant companion. Power was no stranger to him. And yet, his life, meticulously ordered, felt hollow. The following night, he found himself in his private jet, the hum of the engines barely masking his anticipation as they cut across darkened skies. The trip was smooth but silent, with only a few trusted staff on board, all sworn to confidentiality. At last, they began their descent, and Gavin peered out the window as Eldoria emerged beneath him. It was an island of jagged cliffs and dense, mist-shrouded forests, bordered by crashing waves that glistened under the moonlight. As they landed, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp, ocean air. An unfamiliar man in a black suit approached the aircraft with the bearing of a soldier, his gaze fixed and his expression blank. "Mr. Calloway, welcome," he said, extending a gloved hand. Gavin hesitated but shook it. "I don't recall asking for a welcoming committee," he quipped, his attempt at humor masking the tension he felt. The man's expression didn't flicker. "I'll be your guide to the estate, sir. The auction begins at midnight." With each step, Gavin's mind raced. He wanted to ask who else had been invited, but somehow he felt that the less he revealed, the better. As they walked through winding paths that wove through the dark forest, he noticed cameras embedded in the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. Whoever was hosting this event was watching, even now. They emerged in front of a sprawling estate lit by torches and moonlight, an enormous structure that seemed to loom over the island like a spectral fortress. The walls were dark stone, ivy clinging to the structure like the last defense against decay. Even Gavin, who had seen his share of grandeur, felt dwarfed by its imposing architecture. Inside, the estate was no less impressive. The foyer led to vast corridors lit by flickering candle sconces, and portraits of nameless figures lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked. Other guests were milling about, men and women of wealth and status. They were all dressed in black tie attire, some sipping champagne, others speaking in hushed tones. Gavin's guide turned to him. "There are refreshments and a waiting lounge prepared for you. The auctioneer will be arriving shortly." Gavin nodded and strolled into the lounge, where a few others stood, each face both familiar and foreign in a way that unsettled him. He caught snippets of conversation, words that hinted at wealth, legacy, tragedy. These people were all elites, each shadowed by personal mysteries and histories as dark as his own. A woman with striking green eyes glanced his way, offering him a mysterious smile. "You're here for the treasures, too?" she asked, her voice a silken whisper. "Call it curiosity," he replied, matching her stare. "And you?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "Not all treasures are made of gold." As they exchanged cryptic pleasantries, the lights flickered, and a silence fell over the room. A slender figure dressed in dark velvet stepped onto the small stage at the front of the lounge, her eyes piercing as they scanned the room. Celeste, the auctioneer. Her pale skin contrasted against her dark attire, giving her an otherworldly look that was unsettling, if not outright eerie. "Welcome, all of you," she began, her voice as smooth as glass. "Tonight's event is a rare occasion, a gathering for those who seek not only wealth but answers, closure, and even redemption. But what you will find here," she continued, her gaze sweeping the room, "may be more valuable and more dangerous than you anticipate." As she spoke, a projection screen descended, showing a series of mysterious, unmarked crates piled in a locked room. Each crate bore only a number and a single, cryptic symbol etched onto its side. She lifted her hand to indicate the first item, and Gavin felt his pulse quicken. "This evening's first lot," she said, her voice echoing, "is not only rare but intensely personal. It carries the weight of secrets hidden for decades. To bid, you need more than money. You need the courage to face the truth." The projection zoomed in on the crate, and Gavin's stomach clenched. The symbol was one he'd seen before, a shape that held a dark familiarity. It was the crest from his own family's ancestral estate, a symbol that had always represented both pride and curse, depending on who was asked. "Do we have an opening bid?" Celeste's eyes glittered, catching Gavin's gaze. A long silence hung in the air before Gavin raised his hand, almost involuntarily, and placed his bid. Gavin's bid hung in the air as he met Celeste's gaze, his pulse quickening with a sense of inevitability. But he wasn't alone. Others had raised their hands almost as if compelled, each person bearing a look of restrained tension. The room buzzed with whispers as Celeste, lips curving into a knowing smile, signaled the assistant to begin unlocking the first crate. "Tonight's auction is unlike any you've ever attended," Celeste intoned, her voice reverberating in the room's tense quiet. "Each lot is deeply significant to one of you. Our hosts have spent years collecting these items, connecting them with the lives of the chosen few who stand here now." The assistant pulled open the crate's lid with a soft creak, and Gavin felt a shift in the room's air, as though everyone's gaze had collectively narrowed onto the dark interior of the crate. He was barely breathing as Celeste reached inside and retrieved an object wrapped in faded cloth. When she unwrapped it, Gavin's stomach lurched. She held a delicate, tarnished silver locket. Even from across the room, he could see the finely engraved initials Elsie looping along its surface. His breath hitched. Lily Calloway. He recognized it instantly, the very locket he'd given to his fiancée Lily the night she disappeared. A murmur rippled through the room, though he couldn't register the words. All he could do was stare at the locket, the memories crashing into him like a wave. The locket had been a symbol of their love, one that he had clung to when she vanished. He had searched for years, sparing no expense to uncover the truth. Yet the locket had disappeared just as Lily had, leaving only painful memories and endless questions. And now it was here, on this remote island, in the hands of a woman he'd never met before tonight. "The opening bid begins at 100,000, Celeste announced smoothly, her voice piercing his thoughts. He didn't hesitate. His hand shot up, his voice barely steady as he placed his bid. His own offer was swiftly countered by a tall, dark-haired man across the room, his face shadowed with a calculating expression. Another hand rose, a woman with striking green eyes, the same one who had engaged him in conversation minutes earlier. Gavin's chest tightened. It was clear that everyone in this room had arrived seeking something deeply personal, and for some reason, they all wanted Lily's locket. But why? 250,000, he said, barely aware of the words leaving his mouth. The tall man raised again, his voice cool and composed. 300,000. Gavin gritted his teeth. He needed that locket, if only to piece together the fragments of his past and finally understand what had happened to Lily. He wouldn't allow himself to be outbid. 400,000, he called. The green-eyed woman lowered her hand, but the tall man remained steadfast, his gaze flicking toward Gavin with mild curiosity before raising his own hand again. 500,000. Gavin hesitated, his mind racing. This was already more than the piece was worth, at least in monetary terms. But it was worth his entire world in every other way. With a sense of grim resolve, he raised his hand once more, calling out 700,000. Silence blanketed the room as his bid hung in the air. Celeste raised her brow, her smile darkening as her gaze locked onto Gavin's, sensing the intensity behind his bid. 700,000, she echoed. Going once, going twice? A heartbeat passed, then another, before she raised her gavel. Sold. To Mr. Gavin Calloway. The room exhaled collectively as Celeste handed the locket to the assistant, who carefully brought it to Gavin. His fingers tingled with a strange mix of anticipation and dread as he reached for the locket. The weight of it, cold and tangible, sent a wave of memories surging through him. He could see her face so clearly, Lily's soft smile, her laughter on that long-ago night under a darkening sky, when he'd given her this very piece of jewelry. Hold on to it carefully, Mr. Calloway, Celeste said, her voice close and eerily calm. This locket may answer more than you bargained for. Gavin's eyes snapped up to meet hers, questions thick on his tongue, but she had already turned away, gesturing toward the next item. The auction moved on, yet he could barely focus on the proceedings. He clasped the locket tightly, feeling the cool metal press into his palm as the room seemed to recede, the sounds muffling as his mind roared with questions. How had the auctioneers come into possession of Lily's locket? What could they know about her disappearance? The auction continued, each lot revealing an item that triggered similar reactions in the other guests. A faded photograph for one woman, which left her visibly shaken. A set of military dog tags for a man in the back, his expression taut with anger and pain. Each person seemed to have a personal stake in the items, as if they too had been haunted by lost connections, unanswered mysteries, and painful pasts. As the night wore on, Gavin found himself drawn to the green-eyed woman once more. Her bids had been frequent, her eyes filled with an intensity that mirrored his own. He approached her as they took a brief recess, his mind whirling. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "And why are you here?" She turned slowly, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Does it matter? We're all here because of something we've lost." She gestured to the locket in his hand. "And some of us are closer to finding answers than we were before." "You knew about the locket, didn't you?" he pressed, his voice lowering. "You bid on it like you knew what it meant to me." "Perhaps," she murmured. "Or perhaps I was curious to see how much you would sacrifice for it." She paused, her gaze softening. "Be careful, Gavin. This island doesn't give without taking." Before he could ask what she meant, the heavy chime of a gong sounded, signaling the end of the recess. The guests returned to their seats, but the woman's cryptic words lingered in Gavin's mind, twisting into a knot of doubt and foreboding. The locket's weight seemed to increase in his palm, an object that was suddenly more than a piece of the past. It felt like a key, an item holding more than memories, something with the potential to unlock his deepest fears and regrets. As the auction resumed, the items became stranger, more personal, as if carefully selected to lure each guest into bidding for something more than a trinket. Gavin watched as a new crate was brought forward, this one bearing the initials of yet another family crest. He could see the toll it was taking on each person in the room, the vulnerability, the raw emotions that most of them would never display outside these walls. When the final lot had been sold, Celeste dismissed the guests with an invitation to explore the grounds and enjoy the evening at your leisure. But Gavin had no intention of staying for pleasantries. Clutching the locket, he slipped away from the main hall and wandered deeper into the estate, where he found himself in a dark corridor lined with doors. He tried one, only to find it locked, then another and another, until one finally gave way, opening into a dim room filled with tall shelves, all overflowing with files. One glance revealed it was no ordinary storeroom. These were detailed dossiers on him, and, he suspected, on the other guests as well. Each file seemed to hold meticulous records, dates, photographs, even letters that he had long forgotten. His stomach churned as he picked up his own file, his eyes scanning the pages. There were old love letters he'd exchanged with Lily, phone records, hotel receipts from that last, desperate search for her. And there, on the last page, was an unfamiliar letter in elegant, looping script. "You were warned, Gavin. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. But now that you've come, be prepared to pay the price." A noise behind him made him turn abruptly, and he came face to face with Celeste, her eyes glinting with a knowledge that ran deeper than he'd feared. "You didn't think you could come here and simply walk away with your prize, did you?" she whispered, her tone laced with something almost akin to pity. Gavin's blood ran cold as she continued, "You're not the only one who's been searching, Gavin. And now that you're here, we finally have everything we need." Gavin's heart pounded as he stared at Celeste, her eyes unwavering as she blocked his exit from the strange storeroom. The dossier in his hands suddenly felt too heavy, its secrets burning through his fingers. He was barely able to hold her gaze, each revelation in those files searing him with implications he hadn't anticipated. "Why was I invited here?" he demanded, struggling to keep his voice steady. "What is this auction really about?" A slow, almost sad smile crossed Celeste's face as she took a step closer. "You were chosen because you have questions that keep you awake at night. Because you have something left unresolved." Gavin's throat tightened. He wanted to counter her, to deny her words, but they struck too close to the truth. Celeste's gaze softened for a moment before she gestured to the files stacked around them. "These aren't just ordinary items, Mr. Calloway. Each object represents a part of your past, an unsolved mystery, a piece of the puzzle you've ignored for far too long. The question is whether you're ready to face the consequences of uncovering them." Before he could answer, Celeste turned and swept out of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floors in steady, echoing beats. As she disappeared into the darkness, Gavin followed, clutching the locket like a talisman against the chill of the night. Back in the main hall, the other guests were already gathering, each of them bearing the same tense, haunted expressions. The air was thick with anticipation and something darker, something lurking beneath the polished surface of their lives. Gavin's gaze flicked over their faces, recognizing in their eyes the same guarded desperation that he felt in himself. Everyone here was searching for something they could barely name, yet were too afraid to let go of. Celeste returned to the center of the room, her silhouette cutting a striking figure against the dim lighting. She raised her hands to quiet the murmurs and motioned for the guests to take their seats. The hall dimmed until only a single spotlight illuminated the small stage where she stood, her expression unreadable. "Welcome to the true heart of tonight's gathering," she announced, her voice a low murmur that commanded the room's full attention. "Each item in this auction holds a story, a memory, or a buried truth tied to one of you. And tonight, these items will find their rightful owners." A man sitting near Gavin shifted uncomfortably, his hand reaching up to adjust his collar. Gavin felt his own apprehension rise. If the locket had affected him so deeply, what hidden memories or dark pasts were lurking in the room around him? "The first item for bidding tonight," Celeste continued, glancing toward an assistant who entered carrying an old, leather-bound book, "is a journal belonging to one Mr. Charles Ryder." A man seated near the back of the room inhaled sharply. Charles was a portly gentleman in his late 50s, his face ruddy and creased from years of business dealings and high-stakes negotiations. His eyes widened as he recognized the journal, his mouth moving in a silent protest. "This journal," Celeste continued with a cryptic smile, "was recovered from a private office in Paris, the same office where, over a decade ago, Mr. Ryder's business partner vanished without a trace. The pages detail transactions, notes, and a few more intimate details Mr. Ryder believed he'd erased from his life." Charles's face went pale, and his hand jerked upward almost instinctively, signaling his opening bid. A ripple of intrigue washed over the crowd, and the bidding began with feverish intensity. The man's desperation was palpable as he outbid each challenger, finally securing the journal for a small fortune. He looked shaken, his hands trembling as the book was passed to him, the weight of it seemingly more than he could bear. The next item was announced, a silver cigarette case, and as it emerged from the shadowed depths of another crate, a woman in a designer gown gave a stifled gasp. The cigarette case belonged to her ex-husband, a notorious gambler who had lost everything overnight, including her trust. She raised her hand, her eyes glistening with barely concealed tears as she outbid anyone who dared to challenge her. She clutched the case as though it were her very heart, her expression one of private anguish. Gavin watched as each item was revealed, each unveiling a piece of someone's life, a fragment they had thought lost to time or buried by their own hands. A once pristine white glove marred by a single bloodstain. A cracked pocket watch that had been found at the site of a fire. A child's sketchbook filled with eerily familiar illustrations. Each item sold for astronomical sums, driven by the bidder's need for closure or redemption. Or perhaps, Gavin thought, a kind of personal reckoning. Finally, Celeste turned her gaze to the audience, her expression shifting as she prepared to reveal the next item. The final lot of the evening is an item that has remained shrouded in secrecy, she announced. Few have seen it, but many have whispered of it. Two assistants appeared, carrying a long, black box adorned with a heavy lock. With careful precision, they placed it at the center of the stage. Celeste produced a single key and inserted it into the lock, the metallic clink echoing through the silence. As she opened the box, Gavin's curiosity sharpened, drawing his attention toward her every movement. She lifted a dark object wrapped in aged cloth, unraveling it slowly until it revealed an ornate letter opener with a silver handle, the initials GC engraved delicately on the hilt. Gavin's heart thudded. He remembered that letter opener all too well. It had belonged to his father, Gerald Calloway, who had died in what was presumed to be an accident. But the details of his death had never quite aligned, leaving a trail of doubts Gavin had tried for years to bury. This letter opener had vanished on the night of his father's death. Celeste's voice was soft, almost taunting. This letter opener was recovered from a private estate, hidden among personal effects that had not been seen in decades. It was said to hold the final words of a powerful man. Perhaps tonight, it may reveal some of those words once again. Gavin's hand rose involuntarily, bidding quickly, his need to reclaim this last part of his father's life outweighing any rational thought. A man to his left, clad in an expensive suit and wearing an expression of cold determination, immediately countered his bid. The man's gaze was as unreadable as stone, and Gavin felt a spike of irritation. He was willing to go as high as necessary. This item was his. The bidding war escalated, each counter heightening Gavin's desperation. At last, he won, outbidding his opponent with a final, staggering sum that drew whispers around the room. The letter opener was his. As the auction ended, Celeste's voice took on a darker tone. Congratulations to all the winners. But remember, these are not mere items. They are tokens of fate, keys to doors you may not wish to open. The room grew silent as she fixed each guest with a gaze that seemed to penetrate their very souls. Tonight's auction was not a chance encounter. You were invited here because each of you holds a piece of a puzzle that our hosts seek to complete. When you leave this hall, you will find instructions awaiting you in your quarters. Follow them, or do not. But know that leaving Eldoria without fulfilling your part may be impossible. A chill settled over the room, her words igniting a sense of dread. Gavin glanced down at the letter opener, its cold weight pressing into his palm like a warning. The guests dispersed in tense silence, some looking as though they'd received a death sentence. Gavin returned to his quarters, where he found an envelope waiting on his bed. Hands shaking, he tore it open, reading the words written in the same calligraphy as his invitation. Tonight, as the clock strikes 3, return to the main hall. There, you will find the answers you seek. The time has come to learn what you have truly won. He felt a shiver crawl down his spine, but his need for answers outweighed his fear. He clutched the locket and letter opener tightly, feeling them almost pulse with anticipation. Whatever was waiting at 3 a.m., it held the key to the past he had tried so hard to bury. As he waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been trapped in a web he hadn't seen, woven from secrets and lies that could destroy everything he thought he knew. The clock struck 3, and Gavin stood alone in the dim hallway leading to the main hall, his footsteps echoing against the cold stone floors. His fingers closed around the locket and letter opener he'd won, feeling their weight as both a comfort and a warning. The air was dense with an eerie stillness, as though the entire estate held its breath, waiting. When he reached the grand entrance to the hall, he saw that he wasn't the first to arrive. The other guests stood clustered near the center, each holding their auction items, their faces pale and tense. Charles Ryder clutched the leather journal he had outbid everyone for, his eyes darting nervously. Beside him stood the green-eyed woman with the silver cigarette case, her gaze steely. It struck Gavin that each of them looked haunted, shadows of themselves, stripped of their usual grandeur and confidence. At the far end of the room, Celeste stood alone on the raised platform, her figure wreathed in shadows. Her expression was unreadable, and her eyes gleamed with something dark and secretive. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice smooth and measured, gliding through the silence like a blade. "Tonight, you will find the answers you came here to seek, but know that the truth will not be easy to bear." She lifted a slender, gloved hand, gesturing to the wall behind her. With a soft creak, two enormous doors swung open, revealing a narrow corridor lined with unlit torches. Beyond it, Gavin could make out flickers of light dancing along the walls, casting an amber glow that beckoned them deeper. "One by one," Celeste instructed, "each of you will be called to enter the Hall of Shadows, where the secrets you seek lie hidden. The truth waits for each of you within, but it will require payment, not in wealth, but in courage and sacrifice." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Gavin's pulse quickened, a cold apprehension settling over him. He glanced at the others, who seemed equally tense. Some shifted uncomfortably, and Charles Ryder's hands trembled as he gripped his journal. The green-eyed woman held her cigarette case tightly, her jaw clenched. Celeste's gaze swept over them. "Mr. Calloway," she called softly, her voice sending a jolt through him, "you will be the first to enter." Gavin swallowed hard, glancing at the others one last time before stepping forward. The corridor stretched before him, the shadows dancing in strange, unsettling shapes. As he crossed the threshold, he felt an unnatural chill sweep over him, as though he were leaving behind the safety of the known world. The doors closed behind him with a heavy thud, and he was left in near darkness, the faint glow of torches lighting his way. As he moved forward, his footsteps seemed to echo louder, as if amplified by the silent walls. Ahead, he saw an arched doorway, and he steeled himself as he crossed it. The room beyond was small, dimly lit by a single flickering candle in the center. A mirror hung on the wall, framed in tarnished gold. Its surface was murky, as if clouded by a layer of mist. Beneath it, a small wooden table held a folded piece of paper and an old, battered photograph. Gavin's stomach twisted as he saw the photograph. He recognized it immediately. It was a picture of Lily, taken shortly before her disappearance. Her soft smile, the way her hair caught the light. It was a memory frozen in time, one he hadn't seen in years. His hand trembled as he reached for it, feeling a pang of loss sharper than any physical wound. Beneath the photograph was the note, pinned in the same elegant script that had marked his invitation. He unfolded it, and his heart pounded as he read. "To seek the truth, one must first face their own reflection. The mirror holds what you buried long ago. Look and remember." He lifted his gaze to the mirror, which now seemed to shimmer strangely, as if alive. Hesitating, he took a step closer and peered into its depths. At first, he saw only his own face, pale and tense, his eyes reflecting his inner turmoil. But slowly, the image shifted, and he saw himself as he was years ago. Young, full of ambition, and standing beside Lily on the night she disappeared. He could see them in a city square, laughing, the locket he'd won tonight glinting around her neck. The memory twisted, growing hazy, then sharpened into a different image. The last argument they had, an argument he had all but forced himself to forget. In the vision, he watched as they argued over his growing obsession with work, his plans for their future that left no room for anything but ambition. He remembered how Lily had pleaded with him to slow down, to live in the present. But he dismissed her, brushing off her fears as unnecessary distractions. When he stormed off that night, she had walked away alone. The image changed, showing Lily wandering down a darkened alley alone, where a car waited, its headlights off. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression frightened, before the doors swung open and a figure stepped out, a man he couldn't quite make out. She climbed into the car, and the scene faded, leaving only Gavin's reflection, pale and shaken. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. Was this real? or some twisted manipulation meant to torment him. He had long wondered if he had driven her away, if his neglect and ambition had pushed her into danger. But now, seeing it like this, he felt an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The mirror's surface shifted again, this time revealing a note, written in Lily's handwriting, addressed to him. He leaned closer, straining to read the words. Gavin, if you find this, I need you to know I never wanted to leave. I needed to tell you something that would have changed everything. The note ended abruptly, as if she hadn't finished writing. Gavin's stomach twisted, the weight of regret crushing him. He had spent years burying the pain, numbing himself to the guilt, and now, faced with this revelation, he felt hollow. The candle's flame flickered, and he heard a whisper, a faint voice that seemed to echo from the shadows. Do you regret it, Gavin? Do you regret the choice you made? He turned, but the room was empty. The whisper grew louder, filling his mind with a mix of anger and sorrow. If you want to know the truth, you must look deeper. Are you willing to pay the price? Yes, he whispered, his voice rough. I'll do whatever it takes. The whisper faded, and the room shifted once again. Gavin felt a pull, as if the walls themselves were closing in, urging him forward, back to the main hall. As he stumbled back through the corridor, the heavy doors opened once more, and he emerged, shaken and pale, to see the others waiting. He barely registered their gazes, his mind still lost in the echo of Lily's voice. As he walked back into the hall, the green-eyed woman stepped forward, her own item clutched tightly. You found something, didn't you? She asked, her eyes narrowing. Something you didn't expect. Gavin nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to tell her about Lily's letter, about the regrets that now gnawed at him like a wound reopened. But he knew that everyone here was burdened by their own shadows, secrets that threatened to consume them. Next, Celeste called, her voice steady as she turned to Charles Ryder. He hesitated, glancing around as if searching for an escape, but finally stepped forward, his face pale. As he passed Gavin, their eyes met briefly, each seeing in the other the same haunted reflection. One by one, the guests entered the Hall of Shadows and returned visibly shaken, each clutching their items with an expression of grief, shock, or regret. When at last the final guest had emerged, Celeste spoke again. You came here searching for answers, each of you burdened by questions you were too afraid to ask. But now, you have your answers. She paused, her gaze sweeping over them. The question is, what will you do with them? A hush fell over the room as her words settled like a shroud. Gavin looked down at the locket in his hand, feeling its cold metal press into his skin, and felt the weight of the truth he had unearthed, alongside the realization that this truth had changed nothing and everything at once. Some of you, Celeste continued, may choose to return to your lives and let these memories fade. Others may find themselves unable to walk away. But know this, the island has given you what you sought, and what it has given, it may take away. The lights dimmed, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow, stretching toward each guest as if the island itself were reaching out, claiming each of them in turn. Gavin's chest tightened as he realized the truth Celeste had hinted at from the beginning. This place, this island, had brought them here not only to reveal their pasts, but to bind them to it. He clutched the locket, vowing silently that he would leave this place, no matter the cost. But as he looked at the others, he sensed the dark hold the island had on each of them, and he wondered if escape was nothing more than an illusion. The next morning dawned overcast, casting a pale, washed-out light through the thick mist that clung to the island. Gavin woke in his quarters, his mind still muddled with fragments of the night before. Memories of Lily's ghostly image in the mirror, her final note, and that chilling whisper lingered like residue he couldn't scrub away. He reached over to the nightstand, where the locket and letter opener lay side by side. Both items felt heavier now, infused with a dark energy that left him restless. A soft knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Celeste standing there, her expression unreadable but intense. "Mr. Calloway," she greeted him, her voice holding the same mysterious lilt as it had the night before. "Our host would like to extend an invitation to you and the other guests." A private gathering to conclude your stay on Eldoria. Gavin hesitated. What kind of gathering? Her eyes glittered. A final one. A shiver crept over him, but he nodded, following her through the hallways lined with portraits of nameless figures, each painted face seeming to watch him with cold, penetrating eyes. The other guests were already assembled in a large sitting room, each holding the item they had claimed from the auction. They looked as haunted as he felt, weighed down by the night's revelations. Celeste led them to an opulent chamber they had not yet seen, a room filled with lush velvet chairs and walls lined with ancient tomes. It was a library of sorts, though the silence inside felt heavy, as if the very walls were holding secrets. At the center of the room stood a long table set with glasses of wine and champagne, inviting in a way that felt almost sinister. Celeste gestured for them to sit, then poured a glass of red wine for each person, her movements deliberate, calculated. When everyone had a glass, she lifted hers, her gaze passing over them with a solemn intensity. "Here's to truth," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and to those who are strong enough to face it." They drank, some cautiously, others with a resigned sense of inevitability. Gavin took a sip, his mind churning. The locket felt warm against his palm, as though it were vibrating with something unspoken. Across from him, Charles Ryder sipped his wine with a trembling hand, his eyes still distant, focused on some horror only he could see. To his left, the green-eyed woman held the cigarette case tightly, as if it were her last lifeline. Once they had finished their wine, Celeste spoke again, her tone formal, almost reverent. "You each sought answers, and you received them," she began. "But to possess these truths, to truly understand them, a price must be paid. Knowledge, after all, is never free." A chill rippled through the room as her words settled over them. Gavin's heart pounded as he realized what she was saying. The revelations from the night before had not been the final act. They were only the beginning. "What do you mean by price?" the green-eyed woman asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "We already paid in full at the auction." Celeste's gaze softened slightly, though her eyes held a dark glint. "What you bid on last night were items of great significance to you, and in claiming them, you bound yourselves to them. But to walk away with that knowledge, to leave this island with your truths, will require something more." Gavin glanced around the room, catching the nervous glances of the others. The unease was palpable, pressing down on him like a weight. "What exactly are you asking us to give?" Celeste tilted her head, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. "A memory. A single, precious memory. The kind that can shift the course of a life. In exchange, you will be permitted to leave Eldoria and return to your lives. But you will never be able to recall that memory again." The room fell silent as her words sank in, each guest processing the magnitude of the offer. The truth they had sought, the painful revelations they'd unearthed. All of it would come at the cost of something equally profound. A part of themselves would be taken, erased. "Are you saying," Gavin's voice trembled slightly, "you're asking us to erase a memory? To give up part of ourselves in exchange for these answers?" Celeste nodded. "It is a fair exchange. Wouldn't you agree? For truth, one must sometimes sacrifice." A murmur rippled through the room as the guests exchanged wary glances. Some looked resigned, others horrified. Charles Ryder clenched his jaw, his eyes fixed on his journal as though it held the entirety of his life within its pages. The green-eyed woman stood abruptly, her cigarette case clutched tightly. "No, I refuse. I didn't come here to lose myself." Celeste watched her with a calm gaze. "Then you are free to remain on Eldoria, with your memory intact." The woman faltered, her confidence wavering as she considered the prospect of being stranded on the island, bound to its secrets forever. She glanced around, gauging the expressions of those around her. Reluctantly, she sat back down, her hand tightening around the cigarette case as if it could somehow protect her from what was coming. One by one, the guests weighed their options, their expressions flickering between defiance and acceptance. Gavin's mind whirled as he tried to process the implications of giving up a memory, a part of his very being, for the truth he had gained. And then Celeste's eyes landed on him. "Mr. Calloway," she murmured, her tone softer. Have you chosen? He stared at the locket, feeling the weight of his decision press down on him. The truth of Lily's disappearance, the painful reality he'd uncovered. It had opened a wound he hadn't realized was still festering. And yet, to lose a piece of himself in exchange felt like a betrayal. But the alternative was worse. The thought of staying on Eldoria, trapped with the ghosts of his past, was unbearable. He closed his eyes, feeling a sense of resignation wash over him. "Yes," he whispered, "I accept." Celeste inclined her head in acknowledgement, her gaze flickering with approval. "Very well." One by one, the guests followed suit, each voicing their reluctant agreement, the tension in the room thickening with each declaration. Once they had all consented, Celeste gestured for them to close their eyes. "Focus on the memory you are willing to give," she instructed, her voice low and hypnotic. "Hold it close, and when you are ready, let it go." Gavin took a deep breath, searching through his memories for one he could part with. He settled on a moment from his childhood, a day spent on the shores of Cape Cod, building sandcastles with his father. The memory had always held a warmth he could return to, a reminder of the innocence he'd long since lost. Reluctantly, he held it in his mind, feeling its contours, the laughter and sun, and then released it, letting it drift away like a whisper lost on the wind. A strange sensation washed over him, like a part of him had been plucked from his mind, leaving an empty space in its wake. His chest felt lighter, but also colder, as if a vital piece of him had been carved away. When he opened his eyes, Celeste was watching him, her gaze inscrutable. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," she said softly. "You may go." She gestured toward the door, and one by one, the guests filed out, each bearing the weight of their sacrifice in the set of their shoulders, the quiet horror in their eyes. Gavin walked in a daze, clutching the locket, feeling both free and diminished. Outside, the morning mist had cleared, revealing the island's cliffs and dark waters below, the ocean stretching endlessly into the horizon. He wandered toward the docks, where a boat was waiting to take him and the others back to the mainland. As he boarded, he looked back at Eldoria one last time, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and sorrow. He had found the answers he'd sought, but he'd lost something irreplaceable in the process. The boat pulled away, carrying him back toward the life he had left behind, now forever changed. As the island receded into the distance, Gavin felt the emptiness within him grow. The memory he'd sacrificed leaving a void he couldn't explain, even to himself. He gripped the locket tightly, the metal cold against his skin, as if to ground himself in the reality he was returning to. Yet as the mainland drew closer, he couldn't shake the feeling that Eldoria's shadows would follow him, haunting the corners of his mind, a reminder that truth is never truly free, and some mysteries are best left unsolved. As the boat cut through the waves toward the mainland, Gavin sat in the back, staring vacantly at the endless stretch of water. The others were scattered across the deck, each wrapped in their own silence, each carrying the weight of what they had surrendered. No one spoke of the auction, of the haunting memories they had left behind, or of the items they now clutched like lifelines. Each guest seemed as though they were trying to close the door on the dark night that had redefined them. But for Gavin, closing that door was impossible. The locket felt like it was burning in his pocket, a reminder of the truths he'd sought on Eldoria, truths he'd won at a cost he hadn't fully understood until now. He had found out what had happened to Lily, had seen her last night in that mirror, but now the memory felt as hollow as his lost childhood. Each time he tried to dwell on her note, her final words, his mind drifted to emptiness, circling a void that felt unervingly blank. The boat docked at the mainland just after sunset. Gavin stepped off, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet, but not the relief he'd anticipated. He said nothing as he slipped through the crowd of disembarking guests, sensing that they, too, felt bound by an unspoken pact, a vow to leave Eldoria behind, in silence, as if speaking of it would only call its shadows back to haunt them. He took a cab back to his penthouse, the city lights casting their familiar glow across the windows as he sank onto the leather couch. The usual comfort of home, the familiar sound of traffic outside, felt strange, as though the life he'd once known belonged to someone else. As he sat there, the memories of Lily returned, surfacing in fragments he couldn't quite grasp. Each time he tried to hold on to them, to focus on her face or that last night, the memory slid through his mind like smoke, leaving him lost in its empty wake. Over the next few days, Gavin tried to immerse himself in his routine, hoping work would dull the strange numbness that seemed to have settled over his life. But it was as if Eldoria's shadows had followed him. Conversations blurred, emails went unanswered, and his usual sharp focus felt dulled by an invisible weight. He was haunted by the feeling that a piece of him was missing, that a vital part of his past, his connection to Lily, had been eroded, slipping further from his reach each time he tried to reclaim it. One evening, after a particularly restless night, Gavin pulled out the locket and sat with it in his hands, its tarnished surface glinting faintly under the soft glow of his desk lamp. He opened it, half expecting to see a photograph of Lily's face inside, but it was empty, as if mocking him with the silence that now filled his memories. Frustrated, he thumbed over the initials engraved on the outside. The script Elsie stared back at him, offering no comfort, only more questions. He had come to Eldoria seeking answers, and yet the price he had paid, the memory he had surrendered, left him more uncertain than ever. What had he really gained? The next morning, Gavin's secretary called in, her voice unusually tentative. "Mr. Calloway, there's a woman here asking to see you. She said it's urgent." Gavin frowned, feeling a strange prickling at the back of his mind. Did she say her name? "No, sir. Only that she has information about a Lily Calloway," the secretary replied, her voice uncertain. "Shall I send her up?" Gavin's heart stammered. "Yes, immediately." Moments later, the office doors opened, and a tall woman with striking dark hair stepped inside. She was dressed simply, with a slight air of hesitation that made her look vulnerable, though her gaze held a quiet intensity. Gavin gestured for her to sit, barely able to contain his curiosity. "My name is Marina," she said, her voice soft but direct. "I was very close to Lily." Gavin's throat tightened. "You knew her?" Marina nodded, her expression shadowed with grief. "I knew her well. Lily and I were close before she disappeared. She spoke of you often, Gavin. But there's something you should know." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his with a sense of urgency. "She never left you willingly." A chill washed over Gavin. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw what happened to her." She gave him a long, searching look. "I imagine you did, but there's more. She was trying to protect something, a truth that was larger than either of you, and she knew it would endanger you both." He frowned, confusion sparking within him. "What truth?" Marina's gaze softened. "We'll give her one." Over the next several days, Gavin and Marina worked in secret, tracking down every asset tied to Celeste and his father's network. They moved quickly, siphoning funds from various accounts, using aliases and shell corporations to keep their actions undetected. Each success felt like a victory, a step closer to severing the ties that held him captive to his father's legacy. But with each move, Gavin felt the noose tightening. He knew Celeste would retaliate soon. It was only a matter of time. Finally, as they were preparing to initiate the last round of freezes, Gavin received a message that sent a chill through him. It was an invitation, delivered by a courier, bearing only the symbol of Eldoria's compass. "Mr. Calloway, I see you have chosen to reject your inheritance. Meet me at the address below if you are prepared to face the consequences." The address was a familiar one, an abandoned mansion that had once belonged to a powerful family his father had destroyed in a hostile takeover. A fitting place for a final confrontation. That evening, Gavin made his way to the mansion, Marina at his side, both of them silent as they approached the entrance. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made his skin prickle as he pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the darkness beyond. Inside, the mansion was empty, its grand hall draped in shadows, illuminated only by the faint moonlight streaming through dusty windows. A single figure stood at the far end of the room, her silhouette unmistakable. "Celeste," he called, his voice steady but filled with anger. She stepped forward, her face half lit by the silver glow, her expression unreadable. "Gavin, I knew you'd come." He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of everything she had orchestrated pressing down on him. "You've taken enough from me. This legacy of shadows, everything my father built, it ends tonight." Celeste's gaze flickered with a hint of sadness, though her voice was as cold as ever. "You think you can end this? That you can just walk away from the world your father created? This legacy is in your blood, Gavin. It's who you are." He shook his head, his resolve hardening. "No, it's who he was, and you can keep it. I won't let my life be defined by secrets and manipulation." She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "Do you know how many people would kill to inherit this empire? The power you're throwing away? Your father understood the sacrifices that had to be made. He knew that some things are bigger than one person's morals." "Then let them have it," Gavin shot back. "I'm not afraid of losing everything if it means being free from this. You've spent years building a cage around me, around my life, and I'm done letting you control me." Celeste's expression shifted, a flicker of something darker crossing her face. "I always admired your spirit, Gavin, but you underestimate what I'm willing to do to protect this legacy." At her signal, shadows stirred at the edges of the room, and Gavin realized they were not alone. Several figures, silent and faceless, stepped into the dim light, their eyes cold, loyal to Celeste. Marina tensed beside him, and he felt the weight of their odds. But he wasn't here to fight her on her terms. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small device and pressed a button, setting into motion a plan he and Marina had carefully orchestrated. "You may control this room," he said, his voice steady, "but you don't control everything. While you were here waiting for me, Marina and I froze your accounts, shut down every hidden asset you have. The entire network is coming down." For the first time, Celeste's composure faltered, a flash of rage breaking through her mask. "You think you can take everything I've built and just walk away?" she hissed. Gavin's gaze didn't waver. "No, I think I can expose it. I've sent everything to the authorities. Your empire of shadows ends here." With that, he turned, pulling Marina with him as they made their way back toward the door. Celeste's voice rang out behind him, cold and venomous. "You'll regret this, Gavin. You can't escape your father's legacy. No one can." But he didn't look back. As he and Marina stepped into the night, he felt the weight of his family's dark empire begin to lift, a new sense of freedom taking its place. The path ahead would be difficult, but it would be his own. And as they left the mansion behind, Gavin knew that he had finally unbound himself from the legacy that had haunted him for so long. Whatever came next, he would face it on his terms. The shadows of Eldoria, his father, and Celeste were behind him now, left in the ruins of an empire he had chosen to destroy. Gavin felt a strange calm settle over him as he and Marina made their way from the abandoned mansion, the darkness behind them full of secrets finally brought into the light. The empire his father had built, the legacy of shadows that had ruled his life, was crumbling. But as they drove into the city, leaving the ruins of Celeste's hold behind, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that it wasn't truly over. The fallout began quickly. News outlets buzzed with reports about the sudden collapse of several Callaway-affiliated companies. Headlines proclaimed the downfall of a powerful, hidden empire, hinting at scandal, hidden assets, and accusations of corruption that reached across industries. Journalists speculated endlessly about Gavin's role, and his phone rang constantly with questions he refused to answer. But the exposure wasn't enough. Gavin knew there were still lingering threats, the people loyal to his father's memory, those who had benefited from the Callaway Empire's reach. Celeste might have been the empire's heart, but the skeleton was vast and embedded deeply in the lives of powerful people. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings with lawyers and investigators as Gavin provided the evidence he and Marina had gathered. Authorities launched investigations, raiding properties, seizing assets, and piecing together the sprawling network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The world watched, riveted, as the Callaway Empire's secrets unraveled one by one. And yet, Gavin couldn't shake the sense of unease, the feeling that the empire was a hydra with too many heads to truly kill. Then, one evening, as he sat alone in his office, his phone rang. The number was blocked, but he picked up, expecting another journalist. A familiar voice filled his ear. Gavin, I warned you that you couldn't escape. Celeste's voice was colder than he remembered, a quiet fury underlying her calm words. Gavin gripped the phone tighter, his pulse quickening. It's over, Celeste, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Your empire is in ruins. Everything you and my father built is falling apart. She laughed softly, the sound sending a chill down his spine. You think I'm the one who's lost? You've barely scratched the surface, Gavin. You've made powerful enemies, and they won't forget your betrayal. Gavin clenched his jaw. I'm not afraid of them. I'll face whatever comes, but I won't live under the shadow of my father's sins. Brave words, Celeste murmured, but bravery won't protect you. Your father knew what it took to survive. He understood that the world isn't made for people who insist on having a conscience. Gavin felt a surge of anger. I'm not my father. I won't sacrifice everything I am just to hold on to power. A heavy silence filled the line before Celeste spoke again, her voice almost pitying. Then you've already lost, Gavin. Power requires sacrifice, and you've proven that you're too weak to make it. The line went dead, leaving Gavin with her final words echoing in his mind. He sat in silence, feeling the weight of what he had done settle over him. The empire was crumbling, but Celeste's influence lingered like a poison, infecting everything it touched. He realized that she hadn't called to threaten him. She had called to warn him. The enemies he had made were closing in, and he knew that simply dismantling the empire wasn't enough. Determined, he reached out to Marina. Celeste's not finished with us, he told her. She may be hiding, but her network is still active. I need to find her. This won't end until she's truly gone. Marina hesitated, her expression wary. She'll be expecting you, Gavin. She'll have contingencies in place. I don't care, he replied, his resolve hardening. I can't live my life looking over my shoulder. I need to confront her. End this once and for all. With Marina's help, they began tracking Celeste's movements, focusing on the few assets she had managed to keep hidden. After days of relentless searching, they uncovered a remote estate in northern Europe, a place registered under a fake name but bearing unmistakable signs of her presence. Marina insisted on joining him, and together they set out, their destination shrouded in mist and secrecy. The estate was as grand and foreboding as Gavin expected, a sprawling mansion hidden in a dense forest, surrounded by high walls and shrouded in silence. They arrived at dusk, the air cold and still, the only sounds the faint rustle of trees in the wind. Gavin felt a chill of déjà vu. The place reminded him too much of Eldoria, with its heavy silence and sense of isolation. They moved carefully through the grounds, alert for any signs of guards or security. But the estate seemed deserted, as if Celeste was expecting them and wanted them to come. Gavin's nerves were taut, every sense on edge as they entered the mansion's darkened foyer, its emptiness filled with an eerie, expectant quiet. A single light glowed at the end of a hallway, guiding them forward. Gavin exchanged a tense glance with Marina, and they moved toward it, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As they reached the end of the hall, they stepped into a grand room, its walls lined with old, gilded portraits that seemed to watch them with unblinking eyes. In the center of the room, seated behind an ornate desk, was Celeste. She looked up as they entered, her face composed, a faint smile playing on her lips. I knew you wouldn't be able to stay away, Gavin, she said, her voice calm, as if they were meeting for a business negotiation rather than a final confrontation. Gavin stepped forward, his gaze locked on hers. It's over, Celeste. You have nothing left. Her smile widened slightly. Is that what you think? You may have taken the empire, Gavin, but power isn't something you dismantle. It's something you wield. And by destroying the empire, you've left a void, a vacuum that someone else will fill. Do you really think you've done anything more than give someone else the throne? He gritted his teeth, her words slicing through his resolve. I'd rather destroy it than let it corrupt everything I've built. She leaned back, her gaze cool and assessing. You can't erase power. You can only transfer it. Your father understood that. He knew how to build something that would outlast him, something that even you couldn't truly destroy. Gavin clenched his fists. I'm not like him. I'm not like you. I'm done with this game. Celeste laughed softly, a hollow sound. You're more like him than you want to believe, Gavin. The only difference is that he embraced it, while you keep running from it. But you can't run forever. He took a step closer, his voice low and steady. I don't need to run. You're finished, Celeste. You have nothing left. She regarded him with a mixture of disappointment and pity, her voice softening. Do you think you'll find peace, Gavin? You'll live the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering who's coming for you, wondering if you made the right choice. You think destroying me will free you, but it won't. This is who you are. A silence fell over the room, heavy with unspoken words. Gavin felt the weight of her gaze, the finality of her words. He had spent so long trying to escape his father's legacy, but here he was, entangled in its shadows once again. For a long moment, he stood there, searching her face, looking for something. An answer, an escape. Anything that would free him from the cage he had tried so hard to dismantle. But there was nothing, only the cold, unyielding truth that he could not simply erase his past. With a final look of defiance, he turned to leave, Marina close behind him. As they walked away, Celeste's voice echoed after them, quiet and venomous. You'll never escape, Gavin. The shadows will follow you wherever you go. You are your father's son. They left the mansion, stepping into the cold night air, leaving Celeste behind in the darkness. The estate loomed behind them like a tombstone, a reminder of the legacy he had fought so hard to break. As they drove back through the winding roads, Gavin felt the weight of everything he had sacrificed, the emptiness left by the choices he had made. He had destroyed the empire, exposed its secrets, but in doing so, he had unbound the shadows that would forever haunt him. He knew Celeste was right in a way. He would never fully escape the legacy. It would remain a part of him, a dark inheritance that he would carry with him, no matter where he went. But as the city lights appeared on the horizon, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He had chosen his path, broken free from his father's vision, and reclaimed his own life. Whatever came next, he would face it on his terms. The shadows of Eldoria, his father, and Celeste were behind him now, lingering only as memories in the past he had left behind. As the weeks passed, the weight of his choice lingered on Gavin like a scar, a reminder that while he had dismantled his father's empire, the legacy had left its mark on him, etched into his life in ways he couldn't fully erase. The world around him had shifted. Investors withdrew, partners pulled back, and his family name was in shambles. But for the first time, Gavin felt he was moving on his own terms. However, his reprieve was short-lived. One evening, Marina arrived at his door, a grim look on her face. "Gavin," she said softly, stepping inside. "There's something you need to know. Despite everything we did, Celeste still has influence. People in power are sympathetic to her cause, and they're coming for you." He felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Marina set a document on his desk, a classified report outlining a set of allegations tied to him and his family. "It's a smear campaign aimed at discrediting you. Celeste's network isn't gone. They're using every resource they have to ruin you publicly, legally, financially." Gavin's jaw clenched. Celeste might have lost her empire, but she hadn't lost her grip on those willing to follow her, nor her willingness to destroy him. He thought of his family's legacy, the sacrifices made to build it, and the lengths he'd gone to dismantle it. Now, it seemed, his decision to expose it would be used to bury him. As he scanned the report, his chest tightened with realization. His business would be shut down, assets seized, his reputation dragged through the mud. It was everything he'd fought against, everything he had tried to escape. But Celeste had found a way to make sure he paid for what he had done. Marina placed a hand on his arm, her expression unreadable. "There might still be a way out, Gavin." He looked at her, questioning. "How?" She took a breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to suggest. "There's one final asset, a series of coded accounts your father set aside as a contingency, a sort of emergency fund. If we use them, you might be able to protect yourself. It's risky, but it could work." Gavin hesitated, a bitter taste in his mouth. Those accounts represented everything he had fought to destroy, the last remnants of his father's empire, the legacy he tried to leave behind. To access them would mean stepping back into the shadows, dipping into the same world he tried to dismantle. He rubbed his temples, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If I do this, if I use that money, it's like admitting defeat. It's as though I'm accepting my father's legacy after everything I've done to escape it. Marina's voice softened. But what's the alternative? Celeste is counting on you to refuse, to destroy yourself out of pride. This is the only way to survive, Gavin. He turned away, wrestling with the choice. Every fiber of his being wanted to reject the money, to leave behind every trace of his father's empire. But the stakes were too high. If he didn't act, Celeste would succeed in destroying everything he had left, leaving him defenseless. Finally, after a long silence, he nodded. Fine, let's do it. They worked late into the night, decrypting the codes and wiring funds through secure channels. Marina guided him through each step, her familiarity with the system both reassuring and chilling. As they worked, Gavin felt a strange sense of resignation. He was dipping back into the darkness he had tried so hard to escape, accepting the inheritance he had once rejected. When they were finished, Gavin leaned back in his chair, exhausted. The money was secured, his assets protected, and the worst of Celeste's influence neutralized, for now. Marina gave him a small, sad smile. It's done. You've protected yourself, Gavin. But the victory felt hollow. Even though he had thwarted Celeste's plan, the act of tapping into his father's legacy had come at a cost. He had compromised, given up a piece of his own integrity, and now he felt the weight of that choice pressing down on him. In the days that followed, the scandal lost momentum. The smear campaign dissolved, and Gavin managed to keep his company afloat. His father's emergency fund had saved him, but the experience left him changed, more aware than ever of the shadows lingering in his life. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, a small package arrived, wrapped in black paper and tied with a silver ribbon. He opened it, his pulse quickening as he saw a single item inside. A compass, similar to the one that had marked his invitation to Eldoria. Beneath it was a note in Celeste's elegant handwriting. You have made your choice, Gavin. Remember, legacy is not something you escape. It is something you become. The words lingered, a reminder that despite everything, he was still tethered to his father's shadow. But this time, he felt no fear. He had faced the darkness, understood its power, and while he might never escape it entirely, he would no longer be a prisoner to it. Gavin rose, staring out the window at the city below. He could feel the weight of his father's legacy settling within him, but he no longer felt the same need to reject it. Instead, he would redefine it, reshape it into something that reflected who he truly was, not who his father had been. The shadows would always be there, but Gavin was no longer afraid. He had inherited an empire of secrets and lies, and he had taken it apart piece by piece. Now, he would build something new, an empire of his own making, one free from the chains of the past. With a quiet resolve, Gavin placed the compass in his drawer, closed it, and stepped out of his office, ready to embrace the life he had finally chosen for himself.